There's someone in your life who doesn't have Instagram, no TikTok, no Facebook, maybe not even LinkedIn. And when you ask them why, they shrug and say, I just don't need it. You probably thought they were being pretentious, or antisocial, or secretly judging you for posting your breakfast. But here's what nobody tells you. They're not rejecting technology. They're protecting something far more valuable. Let's start with the obvious question. What kind of person chooses to disconnect in a world where being offline feels like social suicide? Research from the University of Oxford tracked thousands of people who quit or never joined social media. The results were surprising. These weren't technophobes or hermits. They were artists, executives, teachers, parents, high-functioning people who just decided the cost wasn't worth it. And when researchers asked why, the answers clustered around one theme: cognitive clarity. People who avoid social media report better focus, deeper thinking, and less mental clutter. Not because they're smarter, because they're not constantly context-switching between their actual life and their performed life. Your brain isn't designed to manage two identities at once: the real you and the curated you. For people who don't use social media, there's only one version. And that simplicity creates something rare: mental coherence. Here's what happens in your brain when you scroll. Your dopamine system lights up with every notification, every like, every comment. But dopamine isn't about happiness. It's about anticipation. You're not satisfied. You're just constantly craving the next hit. Psychologist Adam Alter calls this behavioral addiction. The same neural pathways that activate with gambling activate with social media. Except casinos close. Your phone doesn't. People who don't use social media aren't immune to this. They just recognize the trap early. They saw the pattern. Post something, wait for validation, feel good for 3 minutes, need more validation, repeat until your self-worth is tied to strangers' opinions. And they said no, not because they're disciplined, because they value autonomy more than approval. There's a psychological concept called locus of control. It measures whether you believe you control your life or external forces do. People who avoid social media tend to have a strong internal locus of control. They don't need external validation to feel stable. Think about what social media actually is. A platform where other people decide if your life is interesting enough. Where algorithms determine if your thoughts deserve visibility. Where your mood depends on how many people engaged with something you posted at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. That's not connection. That's outsourcing your emotional regulation to a machine optimized for engagement, not well-being. People who stay off social media aren't missing out. They're opting out of a system designed to make them feel inadequate. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Most people who don't use social media had a moment. A breaking point where they realized the trade-off wasn't working. Maybe they posted something vulnerable and got silence. Maybe they watched their friends perform happiness while privately struggling. Maybe they just felt exhausted pretending their life was more exciting than it was. Whatever the reason, they hit a threshold. And instead of doubling down, they walked away. Psychologists call this psychological reactance. When people feel their freedom is threatened, they push back. For many non-users, social media stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like an obligation. And the moment something shifts from voluntary to required, it becomes oppressive. These people aren't rejecting technology. They're reclaiming agency. Now let's talk about what they gain. Time, obviously. The average person spends 2.5 hours daily on social media. That's 912 hours a year. 38 full days. But it's not just time. It's attention. Nicholas Carr wrote a book called The Shallows about how the internet rewires our brains. His argument? Constant distraction destroys our capacity for deep thought. People who don't use social media aren't just avoiding distraction. They're protecting their ability to think deeply, read long-form content, engage with complex ideas without needing them broken into bite-sized chunks. They can sit with boredom, with silence, with their own thoughts. That might sound boring, but it's also where creativity lives, where insight happens, where you actually process your life instead of performing it. There's also this. People who avoid social media tend to have smaller social circles, but stronger relationships. Robin Dunbar, an anthropologist, found that humans can only maintain about 150 meaningful relationships. Social media promised to expand that. Instead, it diluted it. You end up with 800 friends and no one to call when something real happens. People who don't use social media lean into fewer, deeper connections. They text, they call, they show up in person. Their relationships aren't measured in likes. They're measured in shared meals, honest conversations, and actual presence. Research from the University of Pittsburgh found that people who spend less time on social media report stronger feelings of social connection, not weaker, because scrolling through someone's highlight reel isn't connection. It's voyeurism. But here's what makes non-users truly different. They're comfortable with obscurity. In a culture obsessed with visibility, they chose invisibility. And it's not because they have nothing to say. It's because they don't need an audience to validate their existence. Philosopher Byung-Chul Han argues we live in a society of transparency, where privacy is suspicious. Where not sharing feels like hiding. But people who avoid social media reject that premise entirely. They believe privacy isn't secrecy, it's dignity. That some experiences are more valuable when kept close. That not everything needs to be commodified into content. They living in a way that says, my life is mine, not material for other people's entertainment. Here's the part that makes people defensive. Non-users often report feeling sorry for people still trapped in the cycle. Not in a smug way, in a genuinely empathetic way. They see friends curating moments instead of living them. Friendships maintained through performative comments. Anxiety spiraling from comparing internal reality to external performance. And they remember, because most of them used to be there too. They not superior. They're just on the other side of something you might still be in the middle of. So what does all this mean? People who don't use social media aren't Luddites or outcasts. They're people who made a calculation and decided the cost exceeded the benefit. They traded breadth for depth, noise for clarity, performance for presence. They're not missing out on connection. They're experiencing it differently, more slowly, more intentionally, more real. And in a world where everyone is shouting into the void, hoping for an echo, they're choosing silence. Not because they have nothing to say, because they don't need anyone to hear it to know it matters. The next time you meet someone who doesn't use social media, don't assume they're weird. Consider the possibility that they've figured something out. That maybe the real flex isn't how many followers you have. It's how little you need them.